In this lecture, I want to look a little bit more closely at the different degrees of international integration and focus on the European Union because it's a classic example of how integration can proceed over time with a given number of countries. And so, as we just discussed last time, we looked at the different degrees of economic integration ranging from everything from a partial free trade area all the way through monetary union. And the formation of the European Union is, like I said, it's a nice example of how an area can go through all of these different stages to finally become a monetary union. So here's a little. It's not in the book, but I thought it would be. It's a good thing to know. And so the foundation for the European Union resulted from the Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1951. And so remember, this is shortly after World War II. Lots of interest, especially in Europe. What can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And so this agreement so the basis of the European Union is this agreement on coal and steel. So the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. So the idea was that coal and steel are both crucial and necessary for making war machinery. And the Allies were, at the time, still occupying the coal and steel producing regions in West Germany. So the idea was, rather than having a division between coal and steel production in West Germany and others, is let's create a common market for these two things. And so it was proposed by France initially, and it was signed by Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. These are kind of key countries that we'll see later, and so they're called the Inner Six. So they're the first ones that joined together to form so what is this? We have a limited number of countries with just a couple of commodities forming a partial free trade area. And so the Inner Six we'll see as the EU develops. These are kind of the core. So then a few years later, the Treaty of Rome established a common market. And so rather than just coal and steel, it wanted to broaden the range of goods and services that it applied to. So free trade among a broader range of goods, and it was first to tackle a difficult area, which is agricultural goods. And so they wanted to have set prices across the countries on agricultural goods, and also have the beginnings of a common defense policy, stance towards nuclear weapons, and initial stages of political unification. So that was in 1957, Treaty of Rome, key in the development of the European Union. And then during the 60s, because it was successful, other countries wanted to join. And so these countries, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, Norway, wanted to join. Lots of protests. People in the United Kingdom did not want to join. And same thing in Norway. There were widespread protests in Norway. People were opposed to the UK and Norway. People within those countries were opposed to them joining because a perceived loss of national sovereignty. And then France, even though they're a member of the Inner Six, they didn't want the Brits to come in. Even at that point, there's no love lost between those two countries. And so those countries, so Norway, which remember widespread protests, people in Norway didn't want to join. UK the same thing, and UK wasn't particularly welcomed by France, and so they formed their own free trade area. So the European Free Trade Association. So it's 7 countries that are outside the inner 6, and and so the inner 6 countries not only, remember, they were trying to achieve greater integration and unification, so they not only lowered trade barriers on goods and services within each other, but they also adopted a common policy towards trade policies with other countries outside of the EEC. But because there was concern among these countries with loss of sovereignty, each of these member countries in the EFTA was free to establish whatever trade policy they wanted to with countries, outside of the member countries. And the outer 7 have always been suspicious of the amount of integration that was the goals of the inner 6. So we'll see the distinction between the outer 7 and the inner 6. It persists till today. However, most of the countries in the outer 7 eventually did become part of the EU along with EEC countries. So as the EEC developed, Ireland and the UK were finally admitted, and other countries in the 70s. 1990, Soviet Union fell, and 1993. So it was important because when the Iron Curtain fell, then the distinction between East Germany and West Germany was no longer. So people like this was the time when we can unify Europe. And so the Maastricht Treaty formally established the European Union in 1993. This is huge. And so there are the 3 main, what are called the pillars of Maastricht. So provisions to create a stronger economic and a monetary union. So that was the first discussions on adopting a common currency. So not only free trade amongst our members, labor and capital mobility amongst our members, but also and common external trade policies with non-members, but also let's coordinate our foreign policy and defense policies, and more broad cooperation on other issues as well. So in 1995, more countries joined. 2003, it was a full-fledged European monetary union. So the euro was adopted. And so here, in order for the European Union to become a monetary union, there was spelled out the convergence criteria. So this is what needs to happen in order for us to become a true economic union. Common currency, so the euro was introduced, and we'll look at in a minute here who's adopted it and who hasn't. We need to have common fiscal and monetary policy and price stability, so controls on inflation, common and hopefully low interest rates across. We're going to, so obviously countries that have adopted the euro, there's no exchange rate issues because they use the same exchange rate, but policies, so countries that didn't adopt the euro, then how are your currencies going to be valued in relation to the euro, and desire for balanced budgets, at least more balanced budgets, so we don't have large-scale government debts and deficits, which tend to be inflationary. 2004, 10 other countries joined. And so by 2007, there was a total of 27 countries, so Bulgaria and Romania. The newest member joined in July of 2013, so this brings a total of 28 countries in the European Union. So Croatia was the latest one. They passed a referendum saying that yes, the population in Croatia votes to join the European Union. That's a requirement. So that happened in 2012, and they joined in July. So at this point in the European Union, there's 28 countries, about 500 million people, and a combined GDP of $15 trillion, which is about what the United States has. So here's the inner six here, and then the outer seven. Here's some of the outer seven, and then so here's some of the entrance. So note, Switzerland is not a member. Poland's now a member. These countries are all members. So you can see the inner six still key, and all of the countries in the inner six have adopted the euro. Not so much all of the other countries. So how's the EU governed? So here's the major governing organizations. So the European Parliament, they adopt the budget, and the European Central Bank is the one that is responsible for implementing policies regarding the euro. And what's the money supply for the euro? What are interest rates and inflation policies across Europe? So that's all under the purview of the European Central Bank. This is going to be tough to see, but here's the overall structure of the governance of the European Union. If you want to, you can look at this in the PDF version of the slides. And so there are some major issues ongoing with the European Union. So there's a couple of sticky areas. So as I mentioned, one of the hardest sectors to get agreement is agricultural. And so the European Union has been implementing a common agricultural policy. That's been somewhat problematic, and also the implementation of the monetary union. So let's just take a very quick look at these two. So the common agricultural policy, there's a fair amount of support, domestic support for agricultural products within the EU. And so the common agricultural policy is we're going to allow free trade of agricultural products traded within EU countries. We're going to have common policies aimed at supporting the agricultural sector, and so we'll talk about these a little bit later when we talk about World Trade Organization and different types of agricultural subsidies. So deficiency payments, we'll coordinate those. If we're going to impose output control so we don't have overproduction of certain crops, direct payments to farmers, etc., we will coordinate these. So levies on agricultural products coming in to the EU from other countries. Let's be more responsive to market conditions, and then we will reduce and coordinate our export subsidies. So a lot of countries, including the United States, they have export subsidies. So if a farmer is growing a crop and exporting it to another country, then oftentimes the government will provide a per unit price subsidy, X number of dollars per bushel, for example. And we do that, the United States and the EU both do that quite a bit. So like I said, the variable levies, let's make our tariffs on external products more responsive to market conditions. rather than a fixed tariff, let's adjust it according to whatever the demand and supply conditions are changing. And let's encourage domestic production rather than foreign production. Export subsidies, we mentioned briefly. So if it's not consumed domestically, it'll be sold overseas, and we'll provide some export subsidies, but we will coordinate the level of those subsidies amongst our members. And here's some of the subsidies for agricultural products and the level of support among EU countries and other countries. Another major issue is monetary. And so, as I mentioned, the European Monetary Union are those countries in the EU that have adopted the euro. There's an advantage of having a common currency is it lowers the transaction costs and the risk of trading one country versus another. A major source of risk is if you engage in a contract. So you're selling wheat, for example, to another country. By the time you set the contract and so you agree on a price, and then when the commodity is shipped to the other country and taken delivery in the other country, that's when the payment occurs. Well, if there's fluctuations in the value of the two currencies between that time, and then that creates risk. So using a single currency lowers that risk and other costs of conducting business overseas. Also, it's easier to compare prices and facilitates more uniform prices amongst the members. So that's the advantages of it. The European Central Bank, located in Frankfurt, Germany, is the one that controls the money supply of euros, and also sets, just like the Federal Reserve in the United States, it controls the money supply in the United States, and it sets interest rates. So the European Central Bank has the same functions in terms as the U.S. Federal Reserve in terms of controlling the money supply and short-term interest rates. And then it also is in charge of maintaining exchange rates. So the countries that don't utilize the euro, Great Britain, for example, it fixes the exchange rate between the euro and the pound sterling. So the euro, most of the countries in the EU, 18 out of the 28, use the euro. So here's the list of them. Others, for example, Great Britain, it uses the British sterling, so it's in the European Union, but it's not part of the European Monetary Union. The euro is the second largest reserve currency in the world, the dollar being the most, and it's the second most traded currency in the world, the dollar being the most traded. So like I said, the benefits of a single currency is lower transaction costs, less risk, easier to compare prices. You don't have to account for changes in exchange rates, less uncertainty, less risk for investors, and easier to promote price stability. However, countries that have adopted the euro lose their ability to conduct independent monetary policy. The United States, we have the dollar. Monetary policy is conducted by the Federal Reserve. And so if we go into a recession, the Federal Reserve can target lower interest rates, increase the money supply in order to stimulate the economy. Members of the European Monetary Union, France, for example, cannot conduct monetary policy independent of Germany and the other countries that have adopted the euro, because monetary policy is conducted centrally by the European Central Bank. Also, if France, for example, wants to increase its exports, one way that countries can do that is by lowering the value of their currencies, makes their goods more attractive in export markets. So countries that have adopted common currency lose that ability as well. So there's a little table, and again, you can look at this on the PDF version. So the advantages and disadvantages of adopting a common currency. So challenges going forward. There's been a lot in the news about debt problems, large deficits on the part of some EU members. And so if a country has a large federal budget deficit, one of the things that it can do is to increase its money supply in order to pay off its bills. That tends to be inflationary. And so the ability of the European Central Bank to counter that is a challenging. Also, different countries within the EU have different needs. And so, like I said, one problem is if the European Central Bank is in charge of conducting monetary policy for all EU members, if one country, for example, France is in a recession and Germany is not, France might like to undertake expansionary monetary policy, but it can't. And so there's some difficulties in terms of how does the European Central Bank manage the needs of its different member countries. There's been, as I said, some difficulty for member countries in reducing their budget deficits and their debts, and so there's ongoing negotiations and efforts towards reforming the structure of the EU. So just some problems that have been in the news lately is obviously that problems in Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland joining as well. And in all of this, Germany is the key. And so in order for Greece and now Spain and Portugal and Ireland, since they've been having deficit problems and debt problems, they've been borrowing money from other European members. Germany's economy is doing well, and it's able to and has been willing to agree to finance a large part of the debt that other members are. So this has led to the growth versus austerity debate in the European Union. So countries that are not doing well and have problems, they want to focus on growth, because as their economy grows, then their debt problems will diminish. The other camp is the austerity camp. So the problem is, so Greece, if you're having large-scale budget deficits and debt problems, what you need to do is balance your budget, reduce government spending, reduce pensions. All of that puts a damper on economic growth. And so the fallacy composition is what's good for one may not be good for the rest. So for Germany, the austerity route is the best. For other countries, it's not.
And of course, the major issue facing the EU now is Brexit. So in June of 2016, the Brits voted to leave the EU. It was fairly close, but the Leavers won. And since then, a couple change of governments. Boris Johnson was elected prime minister. He's a confirmed Brexiteer. And so lots of negotiations between Britain and the EU about the terms of their leaving and what the future relationship's going to be. And so lots of delays. And finally, in January of 2020, Britain officially left the EU, but still ongoing issues are on the table. And so there's an implementation period until the end of 2020. And so the major idea here is they're figuring out what's going to be the future relationship between Britain and the EU. And of course, now think we've got January 2020, Britain leaves the EU. A couple months later, we've got the global pandemic caused by the coronavirus, and so the whole global economy is basically got turned into the whirlwind. And so that's what we're going to focus on this week's discussion. So that's the end of this module, and let's move on.